The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Now at Verizon Business, every business can get the new Samsung Galaxy S25 Plus. Whether you're a new customer, loyal customer, or returning customer, this one's for you, you, and you on America's most reliable 5G network. Get the new Galaxy S25 Plus on us, powered by Verizon Business. 256 gigabyte on us. New device payment purchase agreement, select trade-in, and business unlimited plan required. Credit varies by smartphone trade-in. Applied to account over agreement term up to 36 months. Terms apply. Limited time offer.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
Nau mai, hoki mai, kia the fold, imihine, ko Duncan Grieve, tōku ingoa. My guest today is Tim Burrowes, who, as will become manifestly obvious when you get into this, is one of my favourite media commentators in the world. He's an Englishman by birth, but has lived in Australia for 20-odd years, and has a background in B2B media, which, B2B standing for business to business, at essentially trade publications, not mass media, but media about the media, which, can vary wildly in quality. But the thing about Tim is he knows his beat incredibly well. He knows the companies, he knows the personalities, he knows what's rising and falling. And because he's always been in that sector, doesn't kind of have the biases of having come from a different part of it into the trade. So when he writes about it or talks about it, it's with this incredible kind of clarity and insight it's just very even-handed. So I first encountered him through a book he wrote called Unmade, which was about a very, very chaotic decade, the sort of 2010s roughly, in Australian media, which basically just described when the tech platforms came in and started to shake the media industry and how the industry responded to that. And strongly recommend that for anyone who wants to understand what happened to our very near neighbour. You'll notice that over the past year or so, I've been focusing more and more on Australia because I think it's a very similar market to us. It's right next to us, but there are some really crucial differences that I think we need to pay attention to. So, having Tim on the podcast has helped really illuminate that. But he's also, in addition to the book, when I found out more about him, he's the founder of Mumbrella, which is probably the preeminent media trade publication in Australia. And when he left that, he started a Substack called Unmade in the aftermath of the book that comes out most days and gives you a sort of beat by beat happenings and then analysis of those happenings. And it's a Substack, so some of it's free, some of it's not. But it's very readable. It's very rich. But it has a real domain authority across a lot of different types of media, from marketing and advertising to radio, to television, to technology, and it allows you to, if that's the only thing you read out of Australia, you won't miss a thing of any consequence. So I really love it, and if you're listening to this and you're really into the scope of it, Unmade is pretty much a must subscribe to me. The reason I've got him on the show is that we're recording this on a Thursday. It's coming out on a Monday. The following day, if you're in Auckland, he's coming over to do the first Unmade event here. It's called Compass. It's being held in the iHeart Lounge at NZME in the city. He will explain at the end how to get tickets. There's still some available. I think it's going to be a great event, and I'm really glad it's coming here. Yeah, this is just a heap of fun for me, and hopefully for you too. It's Tim Burrowes of Unmade and Mumbrella on the Fold. Tēnā koe, Tim Burrowes, welcome to the Fold.
Oh, thank you so much. I know you. I'm sure you hear this a lot, but long time listener. Very excited.
that doesn't even seem real because I'm such a fan of yours, and I'll start where that began, which was actually through a mutual friend who I'm sure we'll talk about again, who's now a colleague of yours, Hal Crawford, who I can't remember whether he told me about or wrote about a book you wrote called Unmade that later became a business for you, but it describes the 2010s in Australian media and does so in kind of across beats and across sort of sectors and with these kind of participants who move around. It reminds me of the kind of the classic like Wall Street Journal reporter, books of the 80s and 90s, which is the highest praise I have, the likes of Den of Thieves in a local context. I kind of wondered if you could start by just telling me what prompted you to write the book and why that decade seemed so sort of fascinating and transformative.
Well, thank you for saying such nice things about it as well. And yes, I love having those books on the shelf, like Barbarians at the Gate and
so
those
good.
sort of classic business books. I suppose some of the context was I did, I suppose, what I'd think of as the first half of my journalism career, mostly in the UK. So I came to Australia in 2006. So that was when I began to get a snapshot of sort of up close of the media industry. So when it came time to write something, I guess the logical period to cover was something after I arrived. So I began to sort of, I guess, have that slight organising thought that a lot had happened in that what became a 12-year decade of 2010 through to 2021. So that was kind of my original thought, and I must admit I initially had quite a sort of flat idea of a chapter about the ABC, a chapter about Fairfax Media, and so on. And it was actually after I'd taken the idea to the publisher, which was Hardy Grant, that quite late in the process, through talking to another journalist friend who'd published a book, that they made the argument that some sort of 3-act structure like you would traditionally do with a piece of fiction might actually make more sense if you're trying to tell a complicated story, or at the very least, make it a bit more interesting for the audience. So it meant having the office of a kind of crazy person with corkboards and whiteboards and everywhere you looked, sort of little pieces of paper. But once I was able to nail the structure, before I even I guess wrote a single word, it kind of built me something which I could then kind of build on. So yeah, it became very. There was a lot more process behind it, I suppose, than I actually expected. But of course, it was also, to go back to your original question, the reasons for doing it were, as much as anything, it was just that decade where so much happened. Where now I fear we might look back on every decade from now on as the decade where a lot happened. But yeah, it definitely felt that way to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was true all over the world, I suppose. But one thing which stuck out to me, especially compared to New Zealand, was that it was just deal making. That things were sort of ping-ponging around, and that sort of sense of energy that grew out of it. That there was a sort of a fundamental destabilization, but the response of the media giants was to sort of sell things to one another, to grab exciting new things and see what they could make of them. And like I said, in a local context, it wasn't like that to the same extent, at least from my perspective. What do you think drove that? Was that sort of regulation, the kind of personalities involved? It sort of seemed really interesting to me that was how the big media players kind of tended to react to that new environment.
I suppose, yeah, when we look back now, we realise that there was this real changing of the guard happening, that the platforms were there and they were coming, but certainly, at least in Australia, they still had the upper hand, the local players. And we look back and realise that was the last decade where that was true, and it began to change as the decade was going on. So I suppose they were, at that point, doing deals with each other. Now, they were obviously partnering. So we saw, 7 get in bed with Yahoo, 9 get in bed with Microsoft, with 9MSN, and so on. So it was sort of like, I guess, version 1 of the global players arriving. I even remember Fairfax signing some quite big deals with Google around search traffic and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that was definitely a factor. But also, certainly in Australia, there were a small number of predominantly families who still ran things, still had those relationships. So you saw the Packers and the Murdochs carve out subscription television, for instance, and effectively kind of take quite a lot of dominance over sport, and particularly NRL rugby as well. So that was a part of what was going on. And of course, you also just have that generational thing of sometimes the generation that comes along is better than the one before in terms of abilities. That you could potentially say, Rupert Murdoch inherited from his father and built that empire. You also saw Kerry Packer inherit from his father, create that giant empire of Nine and ACP magazines and everything alongside it. But then James Packer not having that same interest and effectively selling down, and it was his decision to kind of get out of media that changed so much of the Australian landscape when it kind of put Nine as the dominant TV network adrift for a while. Magazines never really recovered again in Australia after that moment. So a lot changed as generational change happened.
It's really interesting. The other thing that's, like, as you said, unavoidably, it was the story of the decade in which the tech giants sort of remorselessly rose and would come to dominate as they do now the digital advertising market. Certainly, I remember in New Zealand there was a sort of a famous moment. This isn't quite digital advertising, but it feels like emblematic of the attitude where a TVNZ exec was basically just dismissive of Netflix as I forget the words he used, but there was the sense that because they'd been number one, they'd been unquestioned for so long, that the idea of threat had almost been bred out of them, or the threat was across town and it was a game of inches. It wasn't like the foundations could crumble the way that they ultimately did. Was that the case in Australia as well, that those kind of rivers of advertising dollars that went into television and newspapers and so on, that they didn't see this coming, and thus their responses were kind of late and insufficient?
Yeah, look, it really was. And I immediately kind of think of 2 examples. I remember arriving, as I say, in 2006, and very early on seeing, he's now the late Harold Mitchell, but Harold Mitchell was one of the big media buyers, like the biggest media agency buyer in Australia, giving an address on stage and being asked a question, and him saying, his prediction was that the people who are currently dominant and the winners now would be the winners in the digital space as well. And I kind of remember questioning that at the time. And then the other sort of famous example is Eric Beecher, who owns, amongst other things, Crikey Media over here, but back in the day was a Fairfax and a News Corp editor. Talked about being asked to write a report for the board of Fairfax Media about what the outlook was, and giving this sort of very concerning kind of review and telling them what they should do, and making the warnings about classifieds going digital and all that sort of thing. And he kind of very memorably wrote about how the chairman of the board at the time just picked up the copy of the weekend edition of the either the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age, probably the Age, which of course was massive at that point, with features sections and giant classified sections for homes and for jobs and everything else, but picking up and letting it drop on the table with a thump and saying, I do not want to hear that this will not be our future, which was just classic denial.
That's incredible, right? And I bet you that the thump would not be nearly so loud with that same publication nowadays.
No, having started off as a newspaper delivery person myself, I can remember as a 13-year-old how my back really used to be sore by the end of delivering them, and I think that's one thing we've saved the paper boys and paper girls from, sadly.
It's true. I did my turn selling newspapers as well. It's interesting though, because one thing that comes across reading Unmade, the sort of ongoing publication, is a sense that while Australia has suffered through all this, and while those companies are less powerful, less valuable, as you see through the Unmade Index, which I want to talk about in a moment, they're still very significant players in the local system. They command significant audiences, and when I think about in New Zealand, I think that the equivalents are, for the most part, not always, but they're sort of less structurally advantaged, and that's in part because of the legislation and the way that power is wielded in some ways by media operators there, to essentially strongly suggest to government that they should put legislation in place. To what extent do you think that that microclimate of legislation and regulation and oversight that exists in Australia has protected the local industry to get them to sort of minimise the losses in some respects?
I think it has made some difference, and I suppose over the years, what struck me is often it's been policy making for the benefit of the media owners and the shareholders, rather than necessarily good policy for the audience and the public. Sometimes the two happen to align, and it's often felt like that's more kind of coincidence than the plan necessarily. But I suppose when we look back, one of the things which has protected for so long the free-to-air TV networks is the legislation around sport, the anti-siphoning legislation, which effectively protects not just the key games, but an awful lot of the games. Now, it's also quite a good example where it's not necessarily legislated around the public interest, because all it really does is it gives the free-to-air broadcasters first bite at it, and then kind of gives them the advantage in any subsequent negotiations, including being able to effectively bring on what would have been a satellite or cable partner, but now obviously could be a streaming partner, to effectively help subsidise their bid for the big rights. So you would see often either, well, actually all three of the major free-to-air networks are 7, 9, 10, often end up doing some sort of partnership with Foxtel as the subscription player for one of the big rights deals, where Foxtel will get some crumbs, and yet they would end up, for the rights to that, end up paying sometimes more than half of the actual price in order to access those crumbs. But of course, what it sometimes did was it kept those media companies strong enough to carry on paying for those journalism jobs. So, I guess, we could say that the history of newspapers over the last 200 years has been the journalism and has been a byproduct of the business. And so maybe it's always been thus. But yeah, look, certainly some of that regime now means that probably businesses that might not have survived.
Yeah, you also, I think, I've read, and I think this is something that I kind of want to monitor in a local context, the extent to which having a huge amount of free-to-air sports, and this is where, I think your comment about the sort of the public interest sometimes being aligned, but it being kind of coincidental, it comes up. So one of the big remaining revenue streams for free-to-air in a sports context particularly is gambling, which in Australia I think is one of, if not the biggest country in the world in terms of a per capita gambling losses. And New Zealand's been a long way behind there, but largely because our state-run monopoly has been quite bad at its job, which has ironically been good for us as a country in terms of not being overly penalised by that. Now we've handed that to Entain, which is a big global play that's very active there, and they're starting to massively ramp up their spending. How does, and I know that the Albanese's Labour government was looking to make reforms of gambling advertising, but sort of, again, rapidly realised just what a hard sell that would be into the institutional media owners. Do you want to talk about how gambling advertising impacts Australia, just as a little preview of what is probably coming down the pipe for us in New Zealand?
Yeah, look, one of the things that really struck me about, we might be talking about a decade ago now, was a point where it became so dominant that it became a public issue. It ended up with the face of one of the local bookmakers, Tom Waterhouse, literally sitting alongside 9 commentators during the break in games, sharing the odds, integrated into the show, and even the networks accepted that was a bit much when there was the public backlash. But yeah, clearly, what we have seen is the betting companies realise that a great way for them, an effective way for them of investing their marketing budgets is alongside sport. So the closer they can get to it, the better. And of course, what that does is it makes those sporting rights more valuable for the TV networks because they know they're going to bring in more revenue. So it bids up the rights for the actual sporting codes themselves. So we saw towards the start of the Albanese government an all-party inquiry which came up with a really authoritative report recommending effectively outlawing most advertising of most betting and making a really strong case for the public good that would deliver. And then as the course of the government began to go on, and we're now in the final weeks of it, it became clearer and clearer that lobbying was happening behind the scenes. Yes, it's true that the media companies were against many of the changes. The argument that they were making, obviously, was it would cost them revenue. I always felt that was a slightly weak argument because, of course, if the demand from the betting companies wasn't there, then the next set of sporting rights deals would be at a lower cost. So effectively, the market would in time correct for itself. But I think actually the really powerful lobbying going on was actually from the sporting codes themselves. So it strikes me that was probably what was going on behind the scenes. And what we ended up drifting towards was a Labour government, which is, as we're chatting, is in their last week of Parliament before the election's not been called, but it'll be the last one before the election, without any legislation at all, not small, not big, just none of it, which is one of the other stories of Australia's media is we sort of... We basically have long phases where people talk about changing the media legislation, then very, very short periods where it actually happens, and then we're back to talking about it again.
Must say that's not unfamiliar in New Zealand, though we probably do even more talking and even less changing. So one thing which is a feature of Unmade, this Substack, very, very good Substack that if you're listening to, it's basically a mandatory subscribe from my perspective, is the Unmade Index. Can you describe what that is and the story it has told since inception?
Yeah, so I as you know, in kind of any form of B2B publishing, there's no such thing as a new idea. I remember many years ago talking to somebody who was publishing something in the travel sector, and what they'd done was they just created a Google spreadsheet tracking all of the listed companies, in their case in the travel sector, and just tracking their performance, just like any other index, like a top 200 or top 300 index or whatever. So we created the Unmade Index, tracking the ASX, which is Australia's main stock exchange, and the dozen or so businesses which are listed on there, running locally, which are either media or marketing businesses inherently. It sort of, in order to then kind of create that movement on the index each day, you have to make a few sort of decisions like, although we track the movement of News Corp because they're dual listed in New York and Sydney, we don't actually let them weight the movement of the index because they're so big they would move everything else. And similarly, one of the big retail, one of the big residential real estate companies, Domain, is 60% owned by Nine. So you have to kind of downgrade that, otherwise effectively you're counting it twice. But what it does is it gives us a percentage movement of the unmade index each day, which tells us how the sector as a whole is going. And boy, did that become a depressing process when we started it in 2021. So we started the index with a nominal 1,000 points, and it declined a little bit on the first day and never ever went above 1,000 points in its entire history. And as we chat, I think we're down to about 450 points now. So, the kind of the story that's told is that the value by market capitalisation of the media sector in Australia over the last 3 years since we started it has effectively worse than halved. If you were an investor with $1,000 invested in media back then, your $1,000 is now worth 450 or something like that.
And that feels both shocking, but also not unsurprising. I don't know if I phrased that quite correctly, but that sort of tallies with how the perception of media companies has been globally. What do you view as the main driver of that value erosion? Is it the sort of present dangers of search and social? Is it the future fears of AI? It's interesting. So I just followed Unmade on LinkedIn, and it, once you follow a new account, it gives you an option of 4 others to follow. And instead of it being, the Sydney Morning Herald or the AFR or Capital Brief, it prompted me to follow OpenAI, Canva, generative AI as a topic, and a market research company, none of it which would be media as we would typically understand it. And it was one of those things where you just sort of notice it and you're like, to a lot of people, media is just how slowly will you sink? And I'm curious about your perspective from a local context. Is what's sort of hauling it down?
Yeah, look, and my sense is, I think I agree with you that I think AI is going to be hugely disruptive, but I'm not sure that's even been priced in yet. It feels to me so much it's about where the directions where advertising has gone and is going. And, Australia's advertising market as a whole has a couple of issues, one of which is there are just less advertising dollars being spent across the board, which is certainly a puzzle for me when I look to bigger markets, because you look to the US or the UK and they've been in growth, but I think much more in common. This is where kind of Australia and New Zealand I think have got a lot in common, where there are fewer dollars in the market. Now, one factor in that I think is, when you ask people, well, what's going on there, some of them make the point that there are increasingly decisions made at a regional level now of marketing budgets, and sometimes people are just putting dollars into faster growing markets like India or something. So that can hurt. But I think the other kind of really big factor, which is hidden and not so hidden, is the move across to the platforms. The fact that money is still leaking across to Meta and Facebook, Google, Alphabet, is a big part of it. And it strikes me that there must be incentives for the global holding companies, who own the media agencies that control probably about half of the spend. It feels like there must be incentives for them to be putting more of that share increasingly into the platforms and away from the local players, because it doesn't always make logical sense. Even now, yes, everybody wants the measurability and ROI of digital and the platforms, but it just feels that things are still leaking away in a way which, on the face of it, don't make a great deal of rational sense.
Yeah, so we're talking now about, it gets put under various names, but principal media is one of them. Essentially that, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, that the global holding companies which make system-wide advertising placement decisions on behalf of typically large corporate clients, they do deals at a global level often with the platforms that are then sort of parceled up and distributed down into smaller markets like Australia and New Zealand, where they're, rather than sort of clipping the ticket on the way through, they're actually owning this inventory direct, and therefore they're making higher margins on it, and they have a much more powerful incentive to fill out a media buying schedule for a new campaign for like a telco or a bank that is dominated by YouTube and Facebook, or now Amazon Prime coming into the market very strong, than it is to kind of local players which just don't have the same kind of leverage. Is that fair to say? Because that increasingly feels like a whisper that's becoming more and more kind of well understood in both markets.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation of it, and it is something that is not being talked about enough. Media agencies were called agencies for a reason. They were supposed to be the agent of the client, the advertiser, the marketer. They're supposed to work only in their interests. Whereas now, of course, if you're a media agency and you've got a pool of advertising inventory that has been part of a global deal, then yes, of course, you have the right to sell it to your client, but you're really not acting as their agent anymore. So it's changing the nature of the trading relationship. But I think because the relationship between advertiser and media agencies is so long established, they're going along with it. And it does feel like the whole industry is sleepwalking into this strange situation where the people who are advising them on the most effective ways of spending their money are no longer neutral in that process.
That is certainly what I'm hearing more and more. Something I want to explore in future episodes of The Fold, because it does feel like a fundamental break in what was previously a long-established compact between the sort of advertiser and the person advising them on how to accomplish their ends.
Children's Dimetapp knows the sick day struggle is real. But it doesn't have to be. When sickness strikes, Children's Dimetapp works safely and quickly to relieve cough and other cold symptoms. And your kiddos won't run from its yuck-free sweet grape flavor. Trusted by parents for over 50 years. Children's Dimetapp, your stress-less sick day solution. Use as directed.
This episode is brought to you by Abercrombie. There's nothing better than the perfect jean and going out top combo, or an outfit that perfectly matches your plans. Abercrombie's relaxed jean goes with every occasion. Date nights with something lace, or daytime with a cozy sweater. And their barrel jean will surprise you. It's the trend that will become a staple in your wardrobe. Abercrombie denim comes in tons of rises, fits, and washes. Find your perfect pair online or in store.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
So obviously that is part of this very large and complex story of sort of value erosion and challenge to the local industry. But one thing I really like about Unmade is that it sort of dives deep into every sector in turn, and in so doing, it shows that relatively speaking, some are performing better than others. Are there bright spots? Are there sort of parts of the local ecology that are sort of swimming against that overall tide?
Look, I suppose if you look hard enough, you can find bright spots. You know, as we're chatting this week, we've actually had quite a good couple of days on the ASX for media companies, which at least in part seems to have been inspired by Seven West Media doing their half-year results announcement, which on the one hand was their worst ever, but on the other, they said that they were confident that the market has turned and that their next half will be better. And that's the first time we've seen that sort of guidance from one of the media companies. We'll see Nine's results in a few days, which is the biggest locally headquartered player. The market is clearly optimistic that the same is going to happen for them because their share price bounced by 9% a couple of days back. So there are those sort of bright spots. And I suppose the other thing is, you know, that there is a place for well-run local businesses which possibly will come together through consolidation. So, you know, I'd make the case that the merger. Well, I say merger, really it was a takeover, but the takeover of Fairfax Media by Nine, which would be, I suppose, getting on for 7 years ago now, that was strategically a really good move. It created a stronger business as a result. You know, strong in TV, strong in radio, strong in publishing, including in print, and you know, continues to be. Even though it's been less well run in recent years, it found its foundations and that coming together. So you know, there are still signs where a really good CEO or a really strategic board, even of those big companies, can make a difference. And then, of course, you see, as you always do, innovation come through around the edges. So we're seeing, you know, examples of you know, I think one of the kind of interesting businesses that I like watching at the moment is, which many of the team came out of Fairfax Media, but Capital Brief, which is a sort of, you know, sort of publishing business focused on the kind of business and finance sector. It's a subscription model. Early days, but all of the signs I see from the outside is that that it's going to work.
Yeah, it's a fantastic product as well. I think, you know, Chris Jans and David Eisman have actually played quite a big role in the media here through after they left Nine, working on the collective bargaining that we did with the tech giants. So yeah, rooting for it to succeed, and I think they've just executed well. And if you execute well, there's still opportunity out there, it seems, right? So let's talk about your own products and the execution of them. First, to tell me about Mumbrella, which you founded and eventually exited. What prompted that, and what was the, you know, obviously you could probably do a whole book on that alone, but just give us a sort of a précis of how that went from woe to go, or go to woe.
Yeah, so the role that brought me to Australia was as editor of B&T magazine, which back in the day used to stand for, I think, broadcasting and television. That was very much a print product when I was there. It did an online newsletter, but broadly it was print focused. It still had a weekly magazine. After 2 years of doing that, I was part of the team that started Mumbrella, and really, you know, what we saw was an opportunity to cover the whole of the communications industry. So it was always sort of with that thought that it should be possible to do something that's relevant for marketers, that's relevant for people working in PR, that's relevant for content makers, you know, journalists, TV makers, whatever it is. But, you know, there's enough in common that it could be potentially covered in one place. So that eventually became Mumbrella, started life as a very simple WordPress blog, and, you know, still powered by WordPress behind the scenes. And then so much of that was then classic B2B publishing. So it was you put out your Christmas tree and then you hang the baubles on it, whether it's awards, whether it's training, whether it's conferences, whether it's obviously publishing either online or through email, but all of these things become potential revenue streams so long as you build a brand that the audience believes in. So that was always the organizing thought, was to just really serve our audience as well as we could. So we had there were, by the time 2017 came along, there were 3 of us as shareholders, 2 working in the business, and a third who'd been an investor all along and hadn't really taken any dividends from the business all along. So it was time to find him an exit. And in the process, we ended up selling to Diversified at the end of 2017, which I must admit at the time, I mean, I stayed for probably about 3 years after that. But when I left in, I think it would have been 2021, I didn't really expect to come back again. So it has been a pleasant surprise to find myself once again as a shareholder in Mumbrella in recent weeks.
So tell us about that. So, you went off and started, you wrote the book, and then from the book, the sort of scope was established of a more targeted, I mean, you're a wonderful writer, so there's this kind of stylish, sort of cerebral, analytical tone that comes through there, which is different from Mumbrella, which is more the beat by beat, more of a traditional trade publication. How did the opportunity come to kind of fuse those things again?
Yeah, and it probably was tactical as much as anything. I'd never fully had a plan to leave Mumbrella. I'd always made my peace with it that once you're no longer a shareholder, it's no longer your thing. But come sort of pre-2020, I knew that I was going to have some family reasons for being back in the UK for a while. So we had been talking about me launching, on behalf of Diversified, a Mumbrella UK, or to help them make an acquisition over there that could be rebranded. But that first research visit of February 2020, there was not a second research visit, given the way that the market changed at that point. But I was already committed to going to the UK. So the plan really with Unmade as a publication was, it was a way of, after having to leave Mumbrella because I was leaving the country, it was a way of staying in touch with the market, which I always intended on coming back to. So my lockdown project was writing the book. So I sort of took long service leave from Mumbrella to do that. And then, once I was based in the UK, started doing Unmade. Again, the fact that it was email led was, again, more tactical than strategic, to be honest. I was always interested in Substack, but I got talking to Hamish McKenzie, one of the co-founders, as you would know, is a Kiwi, who I'd interviewed before for Mumbrella, and they were running a thing, I believe it was called Substack Pro, if I remember rightly, but it was about bringing journalists on board. So they provided some financial support for us to launch Unmade on Substack first. And really the only strings attached were that you had to have a paywall as part of the product, which suited me fine. That would have been part of the project. So that was how I ended up building another business in Unmade, which we began to, I came back to Australia and began to do those usual things of spotting niches and running conferences. So retail media was becoming something significant. So we launched Remade as a conference. We do one called Humane, which is about AI. And we also began to do a kind of end of year roadshow called Compass, which was a glorified panel in a pub, basically. But all of this began to sort of grow us as sort of business model. So we were business again. And then meanwhile, sort of, going on back in kind of Mumbrella world, I think there'd been a change of strategy for Diversified Communications, and the word began to sort of come out in the market, and there was reporting that perhaps they were looking to sell. And I ended up having a conversation with long-established local B2B company, Intermedia, who were in conversations with Diversified about making that acquisition. So there are far too many trade titles in Australia. Now, obviously, I can't really complain about that as I'm the cause of a couple of them. But that idea of consolidation began to make sense. So it made sense for sort of me to bring Unmade alongside Mumbrella, and so a division sitting within the Intermedia Group is the Mumbrella Media division, of which I'm a shareholder, and the two key products within that group are Mumbrella and Unmade, alongside all of the kind of associated conferences and things. So it's ended up being quite a lot of plate spinning, sort of since doing that, because in the space of about a week, we completed on that deal, and I also began to do a weekly radio show with the ABC on ABC Radio National called Medialand as well, which goes out on Friday nights and is obviously available on a podcast as well. So suddenly that's a lot of plates that all are spinning.
You're busy, and we're also almost out of the time that you can give us. I want to touch on two things very briefly. First, Hal, friend of the podcast, actually the second ever guest on The Fold, and someone who's returned a bunch of times. You've hired him. Thrilled for him and for you. Tell us quickly what job he's doing over there.
Yeah, so Hal has joined us as editorial director. One of the things that's always struck me about any form of B2B publishing, but certainly was the thinking behind Unmade, the thinking behind Mumbrella, is when you do events, when you do normal publishing, everything should be journalistic. It should be about understanding your audience, understanding what their needs are, understanding what questions they're asking. So the role that Hal will be doing for us as editorial director is across of course, that daily publishing thing, building a team, adding skills to that team. The job description, I think we used the phrase more than once. The job description summed up is get our audience to say that we're the ones who tell it like it is. So that in a nutshell is the job. And that stretches across not just the publishing, but the curation of all of our content for all of our events, how we run juries for our awards. So it's just bringing editorial rigor to everything we do.
That's something he'll do very well there, I'm sure. Lastly, you just described Compass as a glorified, conversation in a pub, but it's coming to Auckland for the first time. I actually emailed you sort of begging for it, and then about a week later it happened. I'm sure those things weren't connected, but I'm really happy because it is a hole in the local market too. Tell us what's happening, what we can expect, where it is, and how people can get tickets. Let's get unjournalistic for a second and let you sell the thing.
Well, thank you. Yes, if you Google the words Compass and Unmade, the link will come up. And as I say, I say slightly dismissively, panel in a pub, but that absolutely is fundamentally where Compass came through. It's sort of. It started out with us organically wanting to bring our audience together, have a conversation in front of them that was recorded for a podcast later. So you make the choice of putting someone from a marketing background, someone from a media agency background, someone from a media owner background, and moderate some questions, take some questions from the audience. So we're doing it. We're doing it on Tuesday in the iHeart Studios in Auckland. So not quite a pub this time. This will probably be one of the more upmarket ones we've done. And it's not a particularly costly ticket. But would love to have a chance to say hello to anybody who happens to be in Auckland on Tuesday night.
I can tell you that I'm heading along myself, and I think anyone who enjoys this podcast, has made it this far, you got to go, because I think, as you'll already know by now, Tim is just such an authority on the whole of the media and has a very clear-eyed view of the thing, which can be hard to find. Tim, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much for coming on The Fold. Really appreciate it.
Oh, hey, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for the work you do, because I love listening to everything you produce.
Oh, thank you so much, and look forward to meeting in real life very soon.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.